The Romans in the first century were struggling with the same issues that we struggle with today, which is 2,000 years later. And that is, what is the value of works and my actions, and how does that play into my salvation? Now, I'm not going to lie to you. If I were to poll 10 people randomly, I would probably get 10 different responses on this. That is, how does what I do in my actions influence my salvation? Does it influence my salvation? Does it change whether I'm going to hell or not? And what do I mean by works? And that is exactly what Paul is writing to the Roman church in the first century about. Literally, an entire book of Romans, while yes, being kind of a thesis for salvation through Jesus, is almost every chapter hits on this subject of grace versus works, and that's what we're going to talk about today. So Romans 4, we're making good progress. There have been weeks where we have gone more than 1 week in one chapter, but this is good. I think we're on a good pace right now. We're going through one chapter a week. And if you remember the first 3 chapters, Paul starts off the letter to the Romans by kind of saying, you know, I'm Paul. This is Christianity. I know a lot of you are in a church or churches in Rome. And here is what the truth of Jesus Christ and salvation looks like. And he's been starting to lay it out, much like a lawyer would do. Kind of cause and effect, laying out kind of a very good argument for grace. And Romans chapter 4 is grace. Again, is another way to call it is really grace versus works. Now here, in chapter 4, he's really going to hammer home the point about what was grace to the Jews of the Old Testament. And he's going to bring up Abraham and also David to some degree. If I were to ask you who was probably one of the most important figures in the Old Testament to the Jewish community, who would you say? It's a very short list. Abraham, Moses, and you just said it. You know it. They knew it. And if you were to, invoke those people to a Jewish audience, you've got their attention. Suddenly they're looking at you because those are the 3 figures that absolutely figure most prominently in their religion and in their background. So it's no accident that Romans 4 is going to continue Paul's tradition here of quoting Old Testament. And again, Paul quotes the Old Testament in Romans numerous times. There's a reason for that. Because his audience is not only very heavily Jewish or has a Jewish background, but they're obviously being influenced by people with a Jewish background. And you can see now, it's like oil and water. And for fellow scientists in here, what happens when you put oil and water together? What happens? They separate. And oil is less dense than water, and it floats right on top. What if you shake it a few times? What happens? It starts to blend together, but does it ever mix?
You get little bubbles of oil in the water.
You get discrete bubbles in both. It never really mixes. It's always this foamy, frothy, what you would call maybe an emulsion, of oil and water. You can definitely apply this analogy to the Christian church in the first century because we have this interface between the Jewish community and their beliefs in the law and the covenants of Abraham, of Moses, of Noah, and this new Christian community, which is coming along and saying, that is all valid. We are, in essence, descendants of that community. Although culturally we may not be a part of that, we are descendants of it in a religious sense. But we have a new message, which is, it is your works and your actions alone that are not going to save you. It's grace. And this message of grace is just like oil and water, grace and works. Now, as it turns out, in an abstract, strange religious sense, both are part of the equation here. One is not possible without the other. And that's another thing that I think a lot of people struggle to understand. And so let's dive into it today. We're going to read Romans. We have the magic microphone again that we're going to pass around. And again, I am working on the audio to this class, experimenting with a few things. We will get there. At some point, we will have the audio of the class recorded in crystal clear, Dolby surround sound stereo. I'm kidding, I don't know. But at least at this point, we will use the magic mic for people who are reading the Bible. So if you are going to be a volunteer, please use this phone and just speak normally, and we should be able to pick it up. Okay. Let's go ahead and read Romans 4. We're going to start off by verses 1. Let's do 1 to 12.
So what can we say that Abraham, the father of our people, learned about faith? If Abraham was made right by the things he did, he had a reason to brag. But this is not God's view, because the scripture says Abraham believed God, and God accepted Abraham's faith, and that faith made him right with God. When people work, their pay is not given as a gift, but as something earned. But people cannot do any work that will make them right with God. So they must trust in him, who makes even evil people right in his sight. Then God accepts their faith, and that makes them right with him. David said the same thing. He said that people are truly blessed when God, without paying attention to good deeds, makes people right with himself. Happy are they whose sins are forgiven, whose wrongs are pardoned. Happy is the person whom the Lord does not consider guilty. Is this blessing only for those who are circumcised, or also for those who are not circumcised? We have already said that God accepted Abraham's faith, and that faith made him right with God. So how did this happen? Did God accept Abraham before or after he was circumcised? It was before his circumcision. Abraham was circumcised to show that he was right with God through faith before he was circumcised. So Abraham is the father of all those who believe but are not circumcised. He is the father of all believers who are accepted as being right with God. And Abraham is also the father of those who have been circumcised and who live following the faith that our father Abraham had before he was circumcised.
Thank you. Okay. Reactions. What do you take away from this first passage here?
Righteousness is for Jews as well as non-Jews.
Oh, this is huge. So right off the bat, Paul is going to say something that I can almost guarantee you is going to tick off half the audience. Explain to me what, and this is not a knock on the Jewish community of the first century, this is truth. How does the Jewish community of the first century view themselves in relation to all other non-Jews?
Superior.
Okay, in a sense superior. And why would you say superior?
Well, kind of like they have the answers and no one else
Okay.
does.
In that sense, I would say yes, you're right. They thought they were right. They were right. They had the right answers. But how else did they view themselves with their surrounding communities?
They were chosen.
The chosen people. And as a chosen people, did they tend to mingle a lot with the surrounding communities? No way. Oh, of course they would mingle in sense of doing business. If you live next door to someone who's a non-Jew, you might say hi to him every once in a while and ask about his goat or something. I don't know. But what about eating? Would you eat a meal with a non-Jew? No. And in some respects, this went both ways. There were many cultures, and you remember back to the Old Testament, the Egyptians. Would the Egyptians eat with a Jew? No way. So it went both ways. But they certainly saw a separation of themselves with others. The core of the Jewish belief is this covenant system. Okay? This idea that a covenant or testament or contract was made between God and the chosen people, which was the Jewish community. That covenant system was started essentially by a man named Abraham. Abraham was the root of their religion, started right at the beginning. And so he was a very special character. If you were to say to a Jew of the first century, and by the way, and let me rewind before I say that statement. There were some very special promises that God made to Abraham during his lifetime. What were they?
I'll give you some land.
Okay, you get land.
Lots of descendants.
Lots of descendants. And thus would become a great what? Nation. Lots of descendants and be a great nation. And the Old Testament, especially Genesis, goes on to delineate that nation amongst its neighbors. And, should I draw a map? I'll draw a map. Ready? Woo! Here we go.
I've been missing.
I know. Withdrawal, right? Don't worry, it's not going to last long. let's draw the Levant. Let's draw the Sea of Galilee, which is not called the Sea of Galilee at this point. This is way back in the Old Testament. We have the Dead Sea. We have the Sea of Galilee, like Kinnereth, Tiberias, etc., etc. Really, we're just talking about this very narrow strip of land here back in 2000 BC that's called Canaan. That's one of the names for it, which is also going to become the land of what? Israel. Even today, this is the modern nation of Israel, a very small strip of land next to the Mediterranean Sea. In the Old Testament, God is going to be very clear with the chosen people. He's going to say, you are going to live next to a lot of very unsavory people, a lot of pagan cultures that do not share your religious beliefs. They don't believe in me, Yahweh, as the supreme ruler of the universe. And they're going to have a lot of pagan practices that are very detestable in God's eyes. Everything from sexual immorality, murder, infanticide, sacrificing of animals to foreign gods, so on and so forth. This is a very horrible thing. So even right from the beginning, the DNA of the Jewish community is prepping them for living with, but not mingling too much with, these pagan cultures that surround them. And one of the big pieces here is this idea that Junior said, which is, but that's okay because Abraham, your offspring are going to be its own great nation, and your children, if you want to think of your offspring, they will be a huge nation, but they will be contained from everyone else. Now, right off the bat, in Romans 4, what does Paul say? And Angela already said this. Let me say it again. Who are the descendants of Abraham?
All circumcised and uncircumcised.
Okay, and you hear that, and you're right. Circumcised and uncircumcised.
Jews and non-Jews.
Jews and non-Jews, and Nathan, you said it.
Through faith before the circumcision, because Abraham was counted, or it was counted to Abraham as righteous before his circumcision.
You're so good, bro. You jumped ahead. This is exactly it. Faith is what's going to delineate them. Now, put yourselves in the shoes, I'm going to go back to this, of a first century Jew. You just heard what Paul just said. What's your first reaction?
Time out.
This is a nice way of, right?
What were the laws all about? Yeah, grab the stones.
That's it. Grab the pitchfork, grab the torch, we're burning the place down, right? I don't know who this Paul guy thinks he is. Now remember too, these people don't know Paul. I mean, 99% of the people getting this letter have never met him. They have only heard stories about him. They've heard mixed stories. Remember, Paul's had a checkered history himself with this community. So this guy, who I don't even know, who I've heard has stirred up a lot of trouble in my community, is now writing to me saying Abraham is the father of everyone. Time out, full stop. What the blank is going on here? This is what Paul is contending with. Maybe one reason why the letter to the Romans is his longest that we have on file. And he's trying to make the case with these people. Look, you have to move past your past. You have to move past what you think you know about your own religion. And remember, Paul is a Jew. Paul is not just a Jew. What kind of Jew is Paul? He's a Jew among Jews. He is a Pharisee. He is a very highly educated Jewish person who knows the Old Testament. You better believe Paul can recite the Old Testament in his sleep. Trained by members of the Sanhedrin, the ruling council of the Jews in Jerusalem. This is no schleb. Okay? So he's got his street cred, and he spends the first part of Romans telling them that, but now he's getting into the meat of it. He's like, I'm going to hit you with what the truth is. The truth is, if you believe that Jesus is who he says he is, you're a descendant of Abraham. What? So let's get at this. We're suddenly talking about a complete shift in mind between works and the law and something that's called grace and faith. Now explain to me what works mean to a first century Jew. What are works? Let's write this down.
Sacrificing,
Okay.
following them in general, following all the laws.
Okay. Yeah. Sabbath. Sacrifice, yep. All of the laws of the Old Testament, starting with the law, which is the first 5 books of the Old Testament, and then expanded over the centuries by numerous rabbis and Jewish theologians and priests. This whole system of things you have to do on the outside. Laws, what you can eat, who you can talk to, when you sacrifice, when you worship, where you worship, when, Sabbath, right? Keeping that holy, do not murder. I mean, the 10 Commandments were just the beginning of all of this. So now you have this guy telling you that, yeah, all that's important, but, okay? And again, we said this last week, for a Jew, there were lots of concepts of salvation, don't get me wrong. There was probably a much wider perspective on what it means to be saved. For a Jew of the Old Testament, it ranged all the way from I might just get buried with my forefathers and then it's oblivion, like literally no afterlife, all the way to people like Paul who believed there was an afterlife, there were spirits like angels and demons, and not only that, but during the afterlife is your body gets resurrected, not just your spirit. So there's a whole range of beliefs there. But they certainly all kind of revolved around this idea that how I acted on the outside determined what would happen to me in the, quote, afterlife. That's what we're getting at here, okay? Now, if how I act on the outside is the sole determining factor for how I am, quote, saved, suddenly you can see here the problem that this community has when this guy Paul comes and starts saying, but that's not the whole story. There is kind of a third act, if you want to look at it that way. You've only seen the movie up till the second act at this point. You stopped it at 9 o'clock because it was your bedtime and you didn't see the ending, right? And you can see how people would be very confused by this. Now Paul's going to say, I've got the ending to this movie here. And it may not have gone the way you thought the first 2 acts went. Abraham, now, you're saying, is the father of anyone who believes through faith that Jesus is who he says he is. That is very different than this. And part of the works, and again, this is, a bit macabre, but circumcision is part of it. And I don't think I have to get into what it is. I think you all know what circumcision is physically for males. But you have to understand what it meant to that community. You were not a Jew unless you were circumcised male. If you were a man and you were not circumcised, you were not a Jew. They would not welcome you into their community. This was the first thing you had to do. Why?
The circumcision of the heart is spiritual.
Yes, so circumcision of the heart, that is where we're heading. But I'm asking for the Jews before grace, what was circumcision? Why did they do it?
Set them apart.
Okay, it sets them apart.
Is it a sacrifice?
It's a sacrifice. Ooh, we're doing all these things here, right? Yeah. Timing is everything. And this is what I really want to get at today. The whole, maybe if I had another title for Romans 4, it's this. Timing is everything. Okay? For the Jew, circumcision was the thing you had to do before you were saved. Before you were welcomed into the Jewish community, before you were called a Jew, and before you could be considered someone that was part of God's chosen people. This had to come first. Okay? Bear with me here. Right? Now, if this comes first, and that has to happen, and all these other things, all these works, they all come first. Cause and effect. For the Jew, works come first, and then you are saved. Okay? But wait a minute. Paul just told me that all I have to do is believe Jesus is who he says he is, and then I'm saved. What? That is completely different than this. You're telling me that first I'm saved and then works happen?
I like how he uses what they know.
Yep.
to make his case about it. That he says, well, Abraham, he's our father, and he asked them the question, was it after his circumcision that God said he was okay, or was it before? And then he's like, no, it was before. And they could look that up, and they know that from their teaching. So
This is a great point for you evangelists. Every person in here I would consider a disciple of Jesus. You're also an evangelist. Congratulations. May not have known that you were, but you are. Know your audience. Know your audience.
Interesting that when Abraham was circumcised, he was true sacrificing because it was painful and everything else involved with that. Then they changed it to when the baby's 8 days old. It's not the baby's choice.
Mm-hmm.
They get to choose. I'm a Jew now because when I was 8, somebody decided for me that I'm a Jew.
Oh my gosh, Ken, this is huge. This is actually a really big deal. Why? Because how many people do you know today from certain Christian denominations who probably mean well had their babies baptized upon birth? Or christened, baby didn't choose. And just because I do something to the baby, you're absolutely right, Ken. This is what he's trying to attack here. Let's go ahead and keep reading.
It was not through the law that Abraham and his offspring received the promise that he would be the heir of the world, but through the righteousness that comes by faith. For if those who depend on the faith by the law are heirs, faith means nothing and the promise is worthless, because the law brings wrath, and where there is no law, there is no transgression. Therefore, the promise comes by faith, so that it may be by grace and may be guaranteed to all Abraham's offspring, not only to those who are of the law, but also to those who have the faith of Abraham. He is the father of all of us. As it is written, I have made you a father of many nations. He is our father in the sight of God, in whom he believed. The God who gives life to the dead and calls into being things that were not. Against all hope, Abraham in hope believed, and so became the father of many nations, just as it had been said to him, so shall your offspring be. Without weakening in his faith, he faced the fact that his body was as good as dead, since he was about 100 years old, and that Sarah's womb was also dead. Yet he did not waver through unbelief regarding the promise of God, but was strengthened in his faith and gave glory to God, being fully persuaded that God had power to do what he had promised. This was power to do with what he promised. This is why it was credited to him as righteousness. The words it was credited to him were not written for him alone, but also for us, to whom God will credit righteousness. For us who believe in him who raised Jesus our Lord from the dead. He was delivered over to death for our sins and was raised to life for our justification.
Thank you, Sarah. There's so much in here that really it is almost one of those cases where we need to go verse by verse because each one carries so much weight. So I want to kind of start back here with what's going on in Abraham's life so we can set the stage. Let's read Genesis 15, verses 1 to 6. We're going all the way back, almost to the very beginning here. Want to understand where Abraham is coming from here. Who would like to read that for me? Okay, thanks.
After these things, the word of the Lord came to Abram in a vision. Fear not, Abram, I am your shield. Your reward shall be very great. But Abram said, O Lord God, what will you give me? For I continue childless, and the heir of my house is Eliezer of Damascus. And Abram said, Behold, you have given me no offspring, and a member of my household will be my heir. And behold, the word of the Lord came to him. This man shall not be your heir. Your very own son shall be your heir. And he brought him outside and said, Look toward heaven and number the stars, if you are able to number them. Then he said to him, So shall your offspring be. And he believed the Lord, and he counted it to him as righteousness.
Thank you. Right at the end, we saw or read the most key part. At what point was Abraham's actions counted as righteousness? When he believed the Lord. His faith. And it's interesting because Paul is here quoting the Septuagint, which is the Greek version of the Old Testament. And that word that he's talking about is this fancy word called logizomai. Now, logizomai might sound familiar to you in English. It's where we get our word logic, to be logical. And it means essentially the same thing back then as it does now. It means to reckon or consider or to think, but it also means to count or to account or to credit, okay? So this word of logos, which is the word, but also means knowledge or wisdom, not only means those things, but it also means an accounting in the sense of a logical kind of computational sense. So when we're talking about these actions being counted to Abraham here, we're talking about his faith. Now, I want all of you to tell me what kind of life Abraham led. Okay? What were his true actions and his works like in his lifetime? Just tell me. Okay, but what did Abraham do, or Abram do in his life? What are some low points, as it were?
He lied to people and said that his wife was his...
Okay.
Well, I mean, his
Yeah.
wife was technically his half-sister, but
Yeah.
he was trying
Wasn't
to be deceitful when he said
so truthful either. Okay, so he was a liar. What else?
He's a coward in a lot of ways.
Coward. Afraid of Pharaoh, so he made up these lies.
There were times that he second-guessed God because, with Hagar.
Ah, okay. Second-guessed God. And what specifically about that incident with Hagar is so egregious?
Adultery.
Well, he slept with his his wife's servant. Adultery, just as bad then as now. Wasn't married to her. Okay, why? Why did he sleep with her? Didn't trust God, and in this sense, what was he not trusting? A very specific thing.
timing, I feel like, because
Yeah.
right here it says Abraham believed God. When God said he was going to give him a son, he believed him, and then God credited it towards him as righteousness.
Okay.
So he did believe it initially, but then, God's timing was that he was going to have to wait a little bit for it, and he didn't want to, he waited, and then he was like, well, I feel like it would have happened by now, so my wife's telling me to sleep with her servant, so I will do it.
Or, maybe they're just kind of, it's running through his mind. God said I was going to have a son, but he didn't say it was with whom.
Ah.
So maybe he meant this one over here instead of this one there, and let's justify this.
Oh, goodness.
He did promise me a son.
And how many, verses in Psalms have we seen where David is trying not to lean on his own understanding? And that's what Abraham is doing here. He's like, well, if I compute it, if I logizomai it my own way. He allows others to influence him. And I'll say evil influence. I'm not saying she's necessarily evil. I'm just saying that allowing others to influence him in bad ways. Abraham has a bad track record, not only before this Genesis 15, but after it, right? And the timing is everything. He kind of goes, remember, we've talked about Abraham. He went in peaks and valleys. Moments when he absolutely trusted God, no doubt, I'm all in, to I'm freaked out and I'm going to do it my own way. If you were to judge Abraham at the pearly gates on his works alone, what grade would you give Abraham?
C minus.
So we've got C minus.
You credit like different things.
And this is my thing. Once you give your grade in your head. Give your grade in your head. If it ain't A plus, he goes to hell. That's what we're getting at here. He was not perfect. He screwed up a lot. How many of us are perfect? How many of us screw up?
All of us.
Okay? And this is what I'm getting at. Right away in the Old Testament, in the book of Genesis, God is clear with his chosen people, and he's now clear with us. Your works alone will not save you. Period.
Think of it, just the utter, as we read that Genesis passage, think of the utter ridiculousness of when he believed, because he said, go outside and look at the stars. There's no light pollution blocking out. I mean, that's a lot of stars back then that he could see, and that's what he believed, that's going to be how many descents. I mean, that's ridiculous.
How many people have been out in the country away from all light pollution and seen the stars? You've never experienced the universe until you've done that. I'm telling you, even in, West Des Moines, Iowa, Ankeny, Iowa, it doesn't even come close. They are millions of jewels sparkling in the heavens, and that's, to Ken's point, it's overwhelming.
And now he's struggling with one.
Yeah.
One descendant.
Mm-hmm. So the sum total of this is your works alone cannot save you. And God is clear it's not going to work. Okay? So what's the alternative? The alternative is Ephesians 2, 8 to 9. The most important verse of the New Testament. I'll just say it. That's Brian Freeman's opinion. If you read one verse in the New Testament, it's not even John. It's John 3:16 plus Ephesians 2. Okay, we'll hybridize it. Ephesians 2, 8 to 9. Who would like to read that for me?
For by grace you have been saved through faith, and this is not your own doing. It is the gift of God, not a result of works, so that no one may boast.
Boom. Period. End of story. Now combine it with what you just read in Romans, where I heard the words, the law makes faith worthless. So it's kind of one of these things. You can either have oil or you can have water, but you can't have both. You got to choose. And what I'm talking about here right now is salvation. The law makes faith worthless. Ouch. What does he mean by that?
Depending on our own stuff, what we do, our own works, we never know if it was enough to save us. We do one thing, maybe good work. Well, is that enough, or do we need to do more? We never know. But with Jesus done it all for us.
Lorna, sweetheart, you said it. You said it perfectly. Whose hands is salvation in? That's what this kind of comes down to. Who has the power to save Brian Freeman's soul? Is it Brian Freeman? If it is, this is the whole point here. If salvation is completely in my hands and it's just about how good of a person I act on the outside and how many laws I follow and how many good works I do and how many boxes I can check off or I think I check off, then who is saving my soul? I am. It's all up to me. Okay? Now Paul is a very logical person. He uses a lot of logizomai, or logismus is the noun. Then if it's all on my shoulders, then what role is God playing in my life? What role does he have to play? What, he's the angel on my shoulder who tells me I shouldn't be stealing cookies?
He still set the standard that you're to live by.
Okay.
You get to choose.
That's it. It's very passive. It's very passive-aggressive, right? He just stands back. He watches you or me. This is the key point here. If my actions alone determine my salvation, then what power does God have at all in anything?
I heard a minister say one time he wouldn't count on the best 15 minutes of his life to save him.
Say it again.
This minister said that he wouldn't count on the best 15 minutes of his life to save him.
That's a good point. Okay, that's awesome, Lorna. Think of the 15 minutes of the best time of your life when you feel like you've been doing everything right. Is it still good enough?
I probably look at my kids and I tell them, I will love you based on how you act and what you do. And leave it up to them to decide whether I love them or not.
And is that love? is that love.
Well, Jesus could save us because he was sinless.
Mm-hmm.
We're not sinless until he saves us. I mean, we're forgiven sinners.
You're so good, sweetheart. You're jumping ahead again. I mean, you've got it right.
Sorry.
Lorna, you're going to teach, sweetheart. You're going to teach. You know it. And this is what I'm talking about here. So this is the next part here. So I really want to talk about this because it all has to do with it, which is payment. Think about this in terms of payment. In the Old Testament, numerous passages refer to the fact that sin is an egregious rebellion against God. It is a rejection of God. It is acting in ways that are morally reprehensible to God. It is essentially acting against God. Okay? In order for sin to be forgiven or covered or wiped away, there's one very important thing that has to be produced. What is that? Starts with B and ends in lud. Got it. Blood. Why would God require something like blood to be shed to cover sins? Why?
Blood gives life.
Blood gives life. Okay, it is life. What is it in a religious sense?
It's a sacrifice.
It's a sacrifice. When you sacrifice something, like let's say you pay your tithe to the church, do you consider that a sacrifice? I do. You know, how many other things do I want to pay, spend my money on? It's a sacrifice. It's in a sense, showing God that you are willing to part with something that may not make you the happiest person, right? And it should, and I'm going down a rabbit hole here, but my point is this, that when you sin, and this is a constant, when you sin, you are creating debt, if you want to look at it that way. You're creating religious debt, moral debt, salvation debt. At some point, that debt rises to the level that it's going to condemn you. If you die today and your sin debt exists at all, you have a debt of sin, what would you say is going to happen to your mortal soul, to your resurrected body? What happens to you in the afterlife? You're going to be judged. You go to hell. You're going to be punished, right? You are not going to enjoy the fruits of glory in the afterlife, okay? Because there's a debt to be paid. Who incurred the debt? That is actually true. Who, aside from Jesus, Brian Freeman goes out and he fudges the truth a little. Not that ever happens. Who just incurred some debt there? This guy. I just incurred debt. Now, according to the Bible, Old and New Testament, if I arrive at the pearly gates, metaphorically speaking, with any debt to my name, am I getting in? You're not. You're not getting in. Now, we start to see what it means when we say things like the law makes faith worthless. If all I care about is the law, and all I care about is I am going to save my soul, what are the chances I'm going to be able to save it?
Zero.
Dude, less than zero. I mean, it's zero, right? Absolutely zero. So there is a payment that needs to be made, and this is where we get words like redemption. Let's see if my Greek's any good here. I think it's lutrao. Lutrosis is the noun. Lutrao means to redeem. What does redemption mean? Saved, but how saved?
You're bought with a price.
This is it, Steve. That is the perfect way to say it. You are bought with a price. Who did we in antiquity tend to refer to people who were being bought with a price? Slaves. Why? Because the cost of a slave in the first century was about 30 pieces of silver. And now you know the Judas connection, that every slave had value. They were their master's property, much like a horse or a cart or a house. They all had value. And if I was going to release that slave or let that slave go, either to give that slave to another, like to sell that person, or to set them free, I had to be paid or repaid for that. I had to be repaid for that. I was the owner of that slave. I had to be repaid. Now, if I sell my slave to another person, who gets the money for that? The slave? Who incurred the debt for that slave? Whose debt is that slave? It's on the slave, because that's the person or the property in which now needs to be paid off. But who does that debt go to? And that's where you're getting at. It goes to the owner. Who owns me in the universe?
I think that's why in a lot of Paul's letters he says a slave,
Excellent, excellent. He himself as a slave. Paul, in the very beginning of Romans, says, I am a slave. I don't think that's an accident, that he uses that exact term, doulos. I am a slave. And now the debt that the slave incurs, right, I incur through my sin, is a debt to who? Whose debt am I building up? Who am I wronging by sinning? It's debt to God. I owe God the price of my slavery. If I want to be free, I have to repay God. He owns me. Just like a master in the first century owns his slave. Okay? Now here is the most important part. Who can repay that debt permanently? Permanently. And this is the key part that I'm going to tell you today. Millions of so-called Christian or non-Christian denominations who claim Jesus as their Messiah get wrong. The payment is I can never repay this debt, meaning I can never get to the pearly gates with a zero sum. Why? I may pay it off a little bit here and there. Sure, I may go out and I may help the poor. Or I might give the homeless guy on the side of the road a gift card to McDonald's. I might teach a Bible class. But here's the problem with economy. As I'm trying to pay that debt off, what am I also doing? I'm incurring more, right? Look, as good of a person as you are, you'll never be able to stop incurring new debt. This just turned into a Dave Ramsey seminar. I don't know how this happened. Now you don't have to go to that because you've heard it all. This is.
I don't believe back. I never heard anywhere in the Bible that said if a slave came across, ended up with 30 pieces of silver in his pocket, he could go say, "I'm free now."
This is a really good point. I almost brought this up, which is just because the slave might come into some money doesn't mean his master is going to let him go. Now, think of it in terms too, Ken, that the 30 pieces of silver is not just a one-time thing. Think of it as if, and you're right, think of it in religious terms as, even if I come up with the payment for the 30 pieces of silver, it's what Lorna said, I'm still incurring debt. Like, I'm never really ever going to hit the maximum, right? Because I keep incurring debt. And now it gets at the difference between grace and works. If I can never, no matter how hard I try, follow the law, no matter how many of these things I keep trying to check off, I can never make it. I can never make it. Who can pay that debt off?
Jesus.
That's it. You got it. You got it. Bless you. You're always right.
If you keep saying Jesus enough times.
Yeah.
If you say Jesus enough times, you're going to be right, right? Someone did have to shed blood for you to pay your debt. Someone, if you think of it this way, did have to be a perfect person. Someone did have to check all of the boxes and not incur his or her own debt. There is only one being that we know of in the universe that has ever done this. Who is that? This is your chance. Jesus. Woo!
I was going to say 8 pounds, 6 ounce, baby, tiny infant Jesus.
That's it. That's it.
I just watched that.
That's good. Oh, okay.
Quote from the
Quote, someone else.
last night.
So here we go. All right. Whose works were needed to make payment for sin? And this is kind of a trick question, right? Someone's works were required. It just turns out that you and I can't ever do this. Jesus, the Messiah, Jesus of Nazareth, who we believe is the Son of God, perfect. Do we believe that Jesus ever sinned? I hope everyone in this class knows this answer. No. If he had, it would have been worthless. Why? Because in order for this payment to work, it had to be perfect. It had to cover everyone's debt. And if there was any debt on his part, it would have canceled that out. Not only would he not have been able to go to paradise to be saved, it wouldn't have covered anyone else's out of it. So now we see the clear message of the New Testament, which is there is only one person who can cover your sin and your debt and pay it in full. And it has been paid in full. When did that debt get paid? On the cross, on the day he died. Why?
It circles back to that blood.
His blood was shed. The blood of a perfect sacrifice was shed. And God, in his grace, accepted it. Now, don't get me wrong. Jesus is God from a certain point of view, but God the Father could have said, I'm not accepting this, even though it was perfect. But he did. And this is so important. That acceptance of that payment is called, the G word, a gift. It's a gift. It's also the G word, grace. Grace is a gift for us. If that's true, and our salvation is not in our hands, but it's in the hands of Jesus, the Messiah, whose hands is salvation? Who decided that we could be saved? God. If it's now God's role, God is all-powerful. He does have the right to decide who is saved and who isn't. He has a role. Right? So then we circle back to, then what was the value of circumcision? What's the value of the law? You heard in here this phrase, where there is no law, there is no transgression. I'm going to tell you right now that is misinterpreted by most people. This is misinterpreted by people that say, oh, well, if there's headhunters in Brazil, they've never heard the gospel, they're not going to hell. Not so fast. That's not what this means. What this is saying is, if there were no law, then you would not be condemned. No one on earth would be condemned because there would be no law. But guess what? There is a law. There was a reason for the Old Testament. And because of that, this is an all or nothing statement. Either no one is condemned or everyone is condemned. That's what this is saying.
Jesus said he came to fulfill the law.
Yep, exactly.
Somewhere in the Bible says that.
Yes.
I also think this makes me think about, Jesus is he's setting the stage for all this.
Yep.
Like when he's talking, they thought the law was for their outward appearances, but Jesus was starting to telling them the law wasn't about outward, it was about your heart, and you needed to obey the law with your heart too. But now Paul is really showing them what
Right.
to do.
This is what all of us ignore. Forget what I'm like on the inside. What am I acting like on the outside? How many people look at Facebook and say, oh, look at all these people with their perfect lives and everything's put together right? How much of that's real? None of it. Everything you read on social media is a fabrication. It just is.
It's just a slice.
It's taking bits and pieces out of context to make it look like these people have everything put together perfectly. That is a great analogy for our dilemma of grace versus works. just because you look like you've got it all put together on the outside on social media, I guarantee you on the inside things are rotten. People have trouble. They struggle. There's marriages that are in trouble. There is children that are going astray. There is, people making very bad choices that they hope never make it to Facebook, right? But guess what? God knows our heart, and this is exactly what Laura is saying here. That Jesus is trying to say all this fake stuff on the outside that you're trying to make look like you're a good person isn't the point. It's who you are on the inside.
It's a little bit of a dilemma, though.
Mm-hmm.
Because if you have what's right on the inside, your works will show through, will produce the right kind of fruit. So it's that struggle, I think, a lot of us run into is, okay, if I behave this way and react this way, that's how I should.
Right.
Maybe you're not doing it naturally. Maybe you're fabricating it.
This is great, Steve. And Steve is absolutely right on to, I'm circling back to timing. Timing is everything in the sense of salvation, okay? So, what comes first, chicken or the egg, right? Does my works come first or does grace come first?
Grace.
If grace comes first, which is what? What would we say grace is? Acceptance that what? Jesus is the perfect Messiah who died for my sins. If I accept that, then what is circumcision?
Baptism.
What is baptism?
Outward symbol of your inward faith.
You have just said, Steve, what 99% of the world struggles with, myself included. What came first? If I truly accept, and you have to accept it, the grace of Jesus. If your heart truly is focused on Jesus as his disciple, what will happen?
You'll become better.
We're going to follow his word.
The works and action, and I'm going to call it here, and I kind of made this at the beginning. I'm not going to call it works, I'm going to call it actions. Your actions will show it. Your fruit will show it. Right?
In 2:4 it says, knowing that the kindness of God leads you to repentance. So God's kindness towards us first.
So let's add, yep.
Then we do something.
This is important, and there's a lot baked into what grace is, right? You unpackage it. There's things like repentance, metanoia, again, a Greek word, but it means a complete transformation of your thinking. It's not just I feel bad that someone caught me with my hand in the cookie jar. It means I'm going to try and be better. I'm going to try and change my heart so these things do start to line up.
I heard it said that about a person's Bible is falling apart, probably has a life that is not.
Lorna, that's awesome. We should put that on our sign for Pathway. That's awesome. That's awesome. So this is it. So timing is everything. Then circumcision, baptism, and good works are what? Pre or post justification signs. This is it. These are the signs that something has changed within you. If you get baptized, you should be baptized after you give your life to Jesus, not thinking it's going to be some automatic check mark to get you into heaven or a baby, right? And what does justification, again, we probably should have defined this in the beginning. What does justification mean? Make right. Yep. In the eyes of God, which we would call what? There's another word for this. Perfect, holy.
Just as if we never sinned.
Yeah, exactly. Sanctified. And this is dikaiosune, that is the Greek here. That is exactly what this means. It means to be made holy, made righteous, sanctified. They all mean the same thing. You're justified, right? Kind of like you've been in a court of law and you have been found not guilty or innocent. I mean, it's kind of another way to think of it. You have been cleared of wrongdoing.
Wouldn't it be great if it lived that way?
This is a great way to end this class. So what do you mean by that?
Meaning if God already sees me that way, I like to say, careful with the expectations that you set for people because they may live up or down.
Ooh.
If God sets that expectation of us that we are justified and we started to live that way, how better we would be. How much, if I want to live up to how he already sees me, I'll do a little different.
Nice.
Sometimes I think, if you do wrong, it's easy to think, well, if I just do A, B, and C, check it off the list, okay, then I'll make up for that. It's an easier way than to think, well, I need to actually give my heart to God, or actually believe, or actually change. It's like I could do whatever it is, sin, and if I do that, it'll make up for it.
Why do we think that? Because there is really no human analog to any of this. If you have a job, you probably have goals or PMDs or a list of things that you have to check off that you do to keep your job, get a raise, whatever, not get fired. If you are raising your children, you have to make sure you send them to school, they get their immunizations, wink, they appear to be good people, right? There is, because our whole lives are kind of focused around this is the way we live our lives. Now that's why it's so hard for us to then say, but that's not how God sees things. And no amount of magic underwear or missionary work to foreign countries is going to save my soul. It's not. Your heart is. Thanks for joining us. We'll pick this up next week.